Okay? This will now be, this is now the 5th lecture. Okay, second to the last. Okay, and hopefully we can cover all the topics in the outline. So this is a much longer topic. I'll probably take 2 meetings to discuss this. So the 5th lecture is on love and human sexuality. And much of the discussion of Wojtyla on love and sexuality were taken from the first book published, Love and Responsibility. Okay. So first, he problematized love and human sexuality. Okay. Now, so aside from the person, one of the other interests of Wojtyla is love, the concept or the notion of love. He discusses the foundation of love in psychology and metaphysics and offers an ethical analysis of love. So in Love and Responsibility, you will see there a psychological analysis, a metaphysical analysis, and an ethical analysis of love. But his concept of love cannot be dissociated from his notion of the human person. Because for Wojtyla, it is the person who loves and is loved. Of course, when he became the Pope, he continued his reflections. Many of his writings, papal writings, also touch on love. And one of those important documents that we have on Karol Wojtyla's or John Paul II's notion of love is the theology of the body. Although it's called theology of the body, it's not really just about the body. No. It's not basically about the body. We have to understand that he takes the body in the theology of the body in the context of the conjugal relationship between man and woman. So it's more, the theology of the body is more of a catechesis on love and marriage. And then of course towards the end about the vocation of the priests. Okay? It's not really just about the body. I don't know why they call it the theology of the body. Okay, anyway. So love will always be related with human sexuality. Okay. So other philosophers would discuss love in itself, love as a general relationship. But in the Love and Responsibility, in the book Love and Responsibility, Wojtyla related love to or with marriage. Okay. And of course, when you put marriage into the mix, then the natural concept that you add to the mix is human sexuality. And that's actually the first part of the theology of the body talks about. Okay? Human sexuality. Human sexuality is an integral part of the human person. And it defines the human person either as masculine or feminine. Now, if there is really, again talking about the papal writings, if there's really one concept that cuts across all the writings of John Paul II from Wojtyla to being John Paul II, it's this concept of love and marriage and sexuality. Well, of course, during his papacy, he was also talking about the human person. So, the sexual act has its own basic nature and natural ends, which is not just to give pleasure to the persons, but to be the process which would bring to life another human being, and thus perpetuate the existence of the human species. So it's not just the purpose, the objective purpose of human sexuality is not just to give pleasure to the man and the woman, but to serve as an avenue where the human species, the human race can perpetuate itself. But human sexuality, for all its noble ends, can also be interpreted in terms of other values and ends. Sex could be used for personal, political, and even economic gains and can be reduced to a valuable commodity. And that is actually the problem of human sexuality in the contemporary times. And of course, you can trace the problematization of human sexuality, you can trace that as far back as the sexual revolution during the 1960s. Okay. Before that, you have the Victorian age, and then all of a sudden, sex becomes, a valuable economic commodity. So that sexuality somehow loses its original value, its real value. Love understood in purely materialistic and egoistic terms, as love as simply to satisfy one's desire, and a hedonistic and manipulative orientation toward sex is a dangerous mix. The sexual urge regarded as simply as expression of desire at the expense of another person. When the materialistic and egoistic attitude towards love is combined with the egoistic attitude towards, the hedonistic and manipulative orientation towards sex, the first victim is the human person himself. Okay? So you see here some kind of ambivalence of the value of love and the value of human sexuality. Ambivalence in the sense that, while on the other hand, it has a positive value, okay, its original, its real value, it can also be reduced and given another value, a negative value, as when we commodify sex, or we simply understand or interpret or practice love in terms of the materialistic attitude. So it is the human person who becomes the object of pleasure and enjoyment, the one who is manipulated and controlled. And of course, while the human person is the victim of the manipulation, victim of the object of enjoyment and pleasure, the irony is that it is also the person who enjoys, who manipulates, commodifies his fellow human being. Okay? That's the irony, that's the paradox of all these values. Because while, for example, a person can be of value, but he could also be a victim, and the one victimizing is also another person. So there is a need to counter these perceptions, these orientations and attitudes towards love and sex. So what Wojtyla tried to do is to counter all these materialistic, hedonistic, utilitarian attitudes towards love and sex. And of course, the recourse of Wojtyla is to go back to the very nature, very dignity of the human person, because it is the same human person who is loved and manipulated. It is the same human person who is, who is reduced as the object of pleasure, and who also gains pleasure at the expense of his fellow human being. So the best way to do this is to ground love and sex on the human person, the very being who is both the subject and object of love and sex. Okay? So again, for Wojtyla, we have to bring back love and sexuality to the very dignity, to the very value of the human person. Love cannot be understood in itself without connecting it with the human person, the very being who loves and is loved. So if you have to counter all these negative, the negative attitudes, the negative orientations towards love and sexuality, according to Wojtyla, we have to bring back the very significance, the very value of the human person. Okay? So to fully understand and appreciate love and sex, we need to go through the human person, understand what and who the human person is, and try to see the connection between love and human sexuality. And of course, the human person. Okay? So again, even in his analysis of love and sexuality, Wojtyla manifests this kind of personalism. At the center of all this is still the human person, both in a positive and in a negative way. Positive because he is the being who has a value, and negatively because he is the same human being who devalues himself and is devalued by another human being. Okay? Now, let's go to his notion of love. So again, as I've said, he relates love and the human person. Wojtyla's reflections on love and its consequences on marriage, because as I've said, in love responsibility, while he was talking in love in general, eventually he connects that with marriage. Okay? Did enrich his notion of the human person. Love is proper only to the human person. No one can love except the human person. For Wojtyla, love has several dimensions, and this he discussed. My father. No. This it is. So here in the book Love Responsibility, he discussed these dimensions: the psychological, the metaphysical, the ethical, which are all connected with the dynamic structures of the human person. So again, it's difficult to understand all these dimensions of love, psychological, metaphysical, and ethical, if we don't have a good grasp of dynamic structures of the human person. If you don't understand, for example, what he meant by self-determination, possession, self-possession, self-governance, integration, fulfillment, etc., etc. Okay? So, even though the two books were published quite separately, okay, like Love Responsibility was published way ahead of the acting person, but somehow it gives us the impression that all of these have already been completed, organized in the thought of Wojtyla. He would publish later on the acting person. Okay? But I think even while he was already giving his counseling to couples, already have this in mind. No? Okay, so in his reflections on the psychological aspect of love, this is just a very general introduction, we'll go into the details. Wojtyla faced the complicated world of human sensuality and human emotions. Human sensuality and human emotions. And here, he's actually doing again, it will help understand this if we understand Thomistic psychology. Okay? So here, human emotions that influence man's activity as a person. Love, according to Wojtyla, is oriented towards a value that is physical and sensible. So, in the psychological level, love is oriented towards a value that we see in the other person. And that value is always a physical and sensible value. Like, for example, the sexual value recognized in the person. Okay? The sexual value recognized in the person. So, but the human person, again, so here he balances everything. But the human person has a fundamental value which is over and above the other values that are found in the human person, like his sexual value. There's a difference between value of the person and value in the person. The value of the person is the dignity of the person as a person. But you can also find some values in the person. Like for example, if the person is wealthy, rich, famous, there's a value in the person. If he is physically attractive, then there is a value in the person. But those values will later on vanish. Okay? I don't know if you can still find an 80-year-old lady as sexually attractive, or still has a sexual value in her, conversely to a 80-year-old or 90-year-old man. But even if the person is already old and all these values in him or in her are already gone, still has a value. The value of the person. So, with you, it's very clear in that distinction, the value in the person that will later on be done, and the value of the person that will never be abolished. Okay. Now, in the metaphysical and ethical dimensions, Wojtyla describes the different levels or types of human love. That is, the love between a man and a woman, starting from physical attraction, then desire, and so on. And how this love between them transformed from the lowest or basic type, the physical attraction, to the most or more sublime and personal level of love, which he identifies as the betrothed love, the conjugal love between man and woman. But Wojtyla, again, displaying a very keen psychological analysis, he said that this highest form of love between man and woman, the conjugal love, cemented in marriage, actually started from a very basic, very crude, very raw physical attraction. Okay? That kickstart the relationship between the man and the woman. So love, he emphasizes, is oriented toward a value, towards something that is good. And again here, Wojtyla explains that the good may also have several levels of goodness. Okay? So, after all, it is a natural inclination toward what is perceived or recognized to be good. Again, so that's very optimistic. Right. So, in the ethical analysis, Wojtyla integrates the love as directed toward the value of the person, which is the object of the will, with the value in the person, which is the object of the senses and feelings. So, like the sexual value of the person is an object for the sense and for the feelings. We fall in love because of the value that we find in the person. Even if you don't talk, for example, the relationship between man and woman, friendship, for example, is based on a value that we find in the person. This person is very friendly. He can be a good companion. He could be a good buddy or a pal or whatever. Okay? But Wojtyla integrates this with the value of the person. So while the person may be the object of love, he must never be treated as a means, but as an end in himself, for he has a value as a person. So again, very clear distinction for Wojtyla, the value in the person and the value of the person. Okay? So there is a value as a man or as a female or as a male. There's a value as a female, as a woman, but there's also a value as a person. Okay? Now, the difference between loving and using. Man, by the very fact that he is a subject, uses various means to attain his end. Okay, so it's natural for man to objectify, certain things, to use, to manipulate certain things. Okay? In fact, the whole created universe is ordained for the utilization of man in order to serve his end. Okay? So one of the first admonitions of God to the first couple is subdue the earth, to control the earth, to govern the earth. Okay? So that's one of the missions of man. This is a basic principle governing the normal condition of man's relation with the objects of the world or with the world itself, and should not pose serious problems to man, because that's the natural orientation of man towards the world, towards the physical objects, to use, to manipulate, to control, to dominate. Okay? A problem, however, arises when this is applied to the relation of human beings to one another. When this orientation towards the physical things or the physical objects are applied to a fellow human being. Okay? Because our fellow human being is not an object like other objects. There are also other eyes. Remember our discussion last time. The other is a now. He is a fellow human being. And therefore, we cannot apply the orientation or the relationship that we establish with physical things to a fellow human being because they are different. Okay? So, this happens when a person is regarded as a means to an end, just like any other objects. Okay? So again, that's another problem. Okay? So for Wojtyla, there's a problem in our attitude towards love and sexuality, and there can also be a problem how we regard the other person. So Wojtyla's basic premise is that a person must not be used or merely used as a means to an end of another person. This using is precluded by the very nature of personhood. And Wojtyla has been talking about, the nature of personhood. So Wojtyla insists that a person must not be merely the means to an end for another person. Nobody can use a person as a means to an end. Not even God, the Creator, who by giving man an intelligent and free nature has ordained that every man will decide for himself the end of his activities and not be a blind tool or equipment or object for someone else's end. So if God cannot regard the human person only as a means, the more that other human beings, the more that the human person cannot regard his fellow human being as an end for his end. Okay? Of course, this idea of man becoming not just a means but an end in itself is not something that is exclusive to Wojtyla, because there are many other philosophers who have expressed similar views. Okay? Wojtyla, in particular, we mentioned about Immanuel Kant. Okay? I think that's the second expression of the categorical imperative. Now, this basic truth about man as an end in himself is a basic component of the natural moral order, and because of this, the natural order acquires personalistic attitudes or attributes, and nature possesses such attributes, for it accommodates both the personal and non-personal entities. So again, he puts in here the personalistic. Okay, now that's of course that idea of personalistic good, personalistic norm, or personalistic value. You can see that across his philosophy. All right. So you have this first sense of using in the sense that we objectify certain things. Okay? And the danger is that this objective means of using can also be applied to the human person. Okay? But Wojtyla talks about another sense of using, not just in the sense that we manipulate, we control certain objects. And this he calls the subjective sense of using. Subjective sense of using. And he connects this to pleasure. To pleasure. So it's not just about manipulating another person because you like for example, you can make a slave out of another person. But in the subjective sense, it's connected to pleasure or to the emotional affective states of the person, which is an integral part of man's inner life. So here, there's a difference between the objective sense of using and the subjective. Because this subjective sense of using another person is connected to our inner life. Man's emotional affective states have a positive or negative coloring, a positive or negative charge, so to speak, on the emotional. Because part of our affective emotional states is that we desire something that will give us pleasure. Okay, so it's not just to manipulate a person, no? Like for example, in the office or in the community, you can manipulate other persons because, well, you always, maybe if you want something done, you always You always call up this person to do all the things for you. So kind of manipulating him. But there's a subjective kind of using when you treat the other person as an object of your pleasure or desire. Okay? So pleasure is a positive charge. Positive. Okay? And pain is a negative charge. Okay? And of course, many philosophers have already expressed the idea about pleasure and pain. You can go back to the pre-Socratics, no? And about pleasure and pain. Some ethicists talk about pleasure and pain. No? Pleasure appears on different shades, depending on the affective or emotional experiences with which it is connected. Pleasure may be sensual satisfaction, or an emotional contentment, or a profound joy. Okay, so we need to recognize that when you say pleasure, pleasure has a very wide range. You can have pleasure, for example, listening to music, or you can have pleasure with, for example, few minutes ago, intense pleasure of the Tawasan community. Okay? That's why Father, I think that's why Father is late. That's why Father, I'm also late. It's difficult to leave not to finish the game. All right. Anyway, so it's a wide range, no? A wide range of emotions, pleasure. Okay, and of course, he was pertaining to the sensual satisfaction because eventually we'll be talking about sexuality. Pain also appears on different forms, depending on the character of the emotional affective experiences which have caused it. So it could be a sensual disgust, it could be an emotional discontent, or a deep sadness. We can just imagine how gloomy it is in Katipunan or in Diliman. Talagang madilim mo yun doon, no? It may be very, very, very sad there. So, well, we're just lucky. No? So, Wojtyla stresses the particular richness and intensity of these emotional affective states, especially when the object of such experience is the person of the opposite sex. Okay, so it has a different level, a different intensity when the object of that pleasure is the person of the opposite sex. Okay, you can never compare, for example, the pleasure. Of course, some people now are what they call this? They are in the highest level of pleasure because of the result of the game. But that pleasure is very much different from the pleasure that somebody can get from out of sexual activity. Okay? So the pleasure of using a person, especially the opposite sex, is more intense than that of a physical object or maybe a situation. And the pain of being used by another person is definitely more severe. Okay? If you're going to ask, what is more painful, losing the basketball game or being, ditched by somebody you love? Okay? If you're a fan of basketball, it's probably more painful to lose in a basketball game than just being abandoned by somebody, by your crush, for example. No? So the emotional states of using a person color the experience and the activity in a specific way, and make the experience and the activity extraordinarily vivid. So, in the light of this assessment, Wojtyla analyzes the second meaning of to use, which he equated with to enjoy. Okay? To enjoy. So to use, okay? So he connects using with pleasure. But that particular sense of using with pleasure is we are enjoying. Enjoying, for example, to enjoy with the person. Right? So here, I quote Wojtyla here, to use means to experience pleasure. The pleasure, which is slightly different senses, is associated with both with the activity itself and with the object of activity. In any association between a man and a woman, And in the sexual relationship itself, the object of activity is of course always the person. And it is the person who becomes the proper source of various forms of pleasure, even delight. Right? So, if this experience or activity of using a person for one's pleasure has a special emotional affective state or charge and specific significance, according to Wojtyla, it is precisely because the source of that pleasure is an object of equal status, of equal value, of equal dignity. The source of that pleasure, the source of that enjoyment is a fellow human being. And therefore, for Wojtyla, it has a more intense, it has a different, specific charge. Because the object of that pleasure is a fellow human being. Okay? So, you have an equal status with the object of your enjoyment. So, the pleasure of using a person is not solely sensual because the natural importance of the contact preserves in every case its interpersonal or human character, especially because the partners in the activity are persons. So even in purely physical love or attraction, okay, physical pleasure, the partners are still persons. They never ceases to be persons, even if in some cases they are not treated as such. Okay? Hence, it is impossible to compare the sexual life, for example, of a man and that of animals, because even if in situations where the human person is treated as a means or simply an object of enjoyment, a prostitute, for example, or in the case of rape, the victim of rape or the prostitutes, they never lose their value as a human person. They retain the value of the human person. So, the sexual life of man is on a personal and moral level. And therefore, sexual morality comes to fore not only because human persons are aware of the purpose of sexual life, but because they are aware that they are persons. Of course, in the moment when, for example, a man uses a woman as an object of pleasure, he may not recognize this woman as a person, but simply an object of his delight, an object of his pleasure. But just the same, he can never deny the fact that this woman, whether he's a prostitute or not, is still a human being. Okay? So, this morality is personalistic, both in relation to its subject and in relation to its object. Because the person or the subject of that relationship, meaning the one who is using, and the object, the one who is being used, they are both persons. So objectively, because it is concerned with the proper treatment of a person in the context of sexual pleasure. So, this is not to reduce pleasure derived from sexual activity as immoral or wrong. Because for Wojtyla, the pleasure associated with sex is not even per se. Pleasure is good in itself. Okay? Whatever pleasure, it is always good in itself. What makes it wrong, what makes it evil is the context within which it is enjoyed. Okay? So, the goodness, the morality, okay, of pleasure will depend on the proper context by which it is enjoyed. Alright? So, the joy of sex, if that is enjoyed within the context of marriage, is good. But if that is done outside the context of marriage, then it becomes bad. So what makes it evil is not the pleasure that is generated, but the context or the relationship within which this pleasure is enjoyed. Okay? So, this analysis has exposed the via negativa, or the negative way, as to the correct attitude to a person. That is, so the negative is that we should not use the person as a means towards an end, for he is an end in himself. So there's a negative way of expressing the value of sexuality and of love and of man by saying that we should never use the person as an object, okay? An object of enjoyment, or simply an object of pleasure. Okay? So, the via negativa is that we should never use the person simply for enjoyment. The positive way is through love. Okay, so the negative way is that we should never use the person. And the positive way is we should love the person. Okay. So, love is possible only if the I and the other has a common end. That means a common aim or objective. Okay. And this is possible if they recognize and desire a common end. And if both recognize and desire their common good, which the I recognizes and desire, there's a missing and vice versa. Meaning, it's the thou also recognizes the common good. Okay. Now, next point. So, the capacity to love, according to Wojtyla, is inherent in the nature of the human person and is bound up with his free will. And therefore, it also depends on the person's willingness to consciously seek a good together with others. So here now, he's now transitioning from love in general to the love between a man and a woman that should be defined by a common good, a good that they share. And this good must be freely determined by each other. So to subordinate himself to that good for the sake of the other, or to others for the sake of that good. So the bottom line for Wojtyla is that one should want the good of the person, orient his own actions towards the good, which is common to himself and to the other, and in doing so, they both respect their freedom. Going back to the idea of using, we never respect the freedom of the other, because we are just manipulating or using or dominating or just treating the other person as an object of enjoyment or pleasure. But of course, in the case of a man and a woman, of a married couple, they both enjoy each other, but this enjoyment is in the context of respecting their own freedom. Okay? So there is, again, in conjugal love, for Wojtyla, there is a free, there's a free self-giving between the man, the husband, and the wife. So you go back again to the idea of self-determination. So, in an act oriented by love, the other's good becomes, in effect, one's own good. Again, you can go back to the idea of reciprocity, the one that we discussed last time. No? Reciprocity between the I and the thou. Neither of them uses the other for his or her own ends, but both are engaged in a movement towards a common objective good, which is the good of each other. Okay? In using, the only good that is respected, the only good that is, the only good that is desired is the good of the one using. Okay? At the expense of the other person. Right? Any questions so far? Yes.
Given that common good is the good of both the husband and the wife in the context of marriage, and also the ends of marital life, the upbringing of children, and education. But if, for example, that couple is experiencing problem in the marriage,
Okay.
like for example, the husband is giving up on their married life, and yet the wife is the one who is working out for the survival of marriage, and we still define it as coming good when it's only the one person who is working out for the survival of their marriage.
But well, in the case, we can no longer say that there is a love between the husband and the wife. There is not just a love on the part, maybe on the part of the wife, and the husband has lost his, has lost his orientation or his attitude towards the good of the family or the good of the marriage. Okay. So it's difficult now to say whether there still exists a common good between the husband and the wife. But of course, your question is about a particular situation. It's a particular situation. Wojtyla here is talking about, in general, what should be the basis of the love between the man and the woman. And that's why for me it's very important that love between the man and the woman, it should really take some time to know each other and to really recognize what is common between them. And they are going to raise a family that it will take more sacrifice. In fact, the greatest sacrifice in marriage is losing somebody. Remember, Wojtyla talks about the non-alterability. That the person can never be, nobody can love for me, nobody can do that, non-transferability. But in marriage, it actually becomes the ultimate sacrifice in marriage, because you give up yourself, you offer yourself as a kind of a gift to the other person. So in the theology of the body, he was actually talking of the nuptial gift. It's the ultimate, the highest expression of love, when you give yourself to the other freely. But of course, in that case, in your example, apparently the husband has lost this sense of marriage as a kind of mutual self-giving. Okay? But of course, the next question there would be, should we still maintain the relationship, the marriage between the two? And of course, that has always been the argument of those who favor divorce. Because there will, of course, this is not the general rule, but there will be some moments in the life of the couple, extreme situation where they can no longer live together. The promise of, self-giving, of love, is already gone. So, for them, the question is, what is the use of staying in marriage if that is the case? I mean, it's a very strong argument of those people who believe in divorce. Because all that they are asking is a chance for another person to start a new relationship. Because, of course, the argument of the church and our argument is always that what God has joined together, it can never be separated. But we are talking of that at the beginning of the relationship. What about if you are already in that relationship and then, for some reason, this bond is broken and it can no longer be repaired? Of course, the answer, well, let them just be let them just separate. So the answer of the church is separation, not divorce. But suppose the separated person, individual, wants to start another relationship. He cannot, or she cannot, because there is no divorce. Of course, we can always say, you should have thought about this before you get married. You know, that's why there should be counseling and soul searching. You know, and really before entering into that kind of relationship. But even those people who have really gone through all this process of really searching themselves, of really promising each other, some of them end up separated. So I'm not arguing for divorce. I'm just saying that it's a very valid point of those people who advocate divorce. Because by divorce, it's not just that they want to separate, they want to start a new life. But because there is no divorce, they cannot start a new life or a new relationship. So if for example, a woman or a man comes to you for advice, what would you advise? Just tell them it's not permitted in the church. Just stay separate. You can say that. You have to give a good, good explanation for this, but it's very difficult to give them good advice. Yes.
You have not discussed yet about marriage, but preempting, talking about trying to dissolve marriage is like trying to dissolve. I was just going to give an analogy to it. It's just like trying to dissolve a legal contract, which is binding. Example, you have a business partner, then your contract is binding for at least 20 years.
Okay.
And the only way that you could separate, let's use the marital natural dissolution is death. So what if that is the only time that you can separate as business partners? Death. So I'm just going to give an example. If you are not going to work together, you cannot resolve to say, I give up. Hindi na ako pwede. I don't want to be a business partner to you. The contract is binding in the eyes of the law, human law. So, if I'm trying to see it in the argument of the church, I think it's more of a legalistic proceeding, wherein we are trying to call on the authority of God as the one who binds the contract, and the two of them, the husband and the wife, are freely consenting to do that contract and to have that contract dissolved only by death. So in that case, it doesn't matter if they feel they don't want anymore, because the contract that they have signed in that sense is a free act. It can only be dissolved by what is agreed, by what is agreed, and that is death. So in that case, it is difficult to explain to people that this relationship is still binding, because it's a very legalistic mental. It's very, what do you call this? It's in that state of a legal concept, and we cannot just give it to people because they won't understand. Because they would just say, "This is what I feel."
You can explain it that way because they will not understand.
Yeah. Even if we are going to convince them that about many things, it will not work out because the actual experience is totally contradictory to the common good, as you said. So I do not favor divorce, but that is a very difficult, as you said also, agreeing with you. It's a difficult issue to explain to people. Because if you will try to engage in that, what if the people who are involved would say, the husband is almost killing me, so what should I do, stay? he's hurting the children. I don't know. So it's difficult to explain.
It's one thing to explain to them the basis of the church of not favoring divorce, and it's another thing to answer the question of those who advocate divorce. Because certainly, while some people may not understand what these things, but definitely those who argue for divorce, they can understand. So my point is, how are we going to argue with them?
To those who are opposing.
With those who are opposing, because certainly they understand. They understand our position, and they also have their own argument. The only, I don't know if I'm accurate here, but the only country, the Vatican excluded, the only country in the whole world that does not have divorce law is the Philippines. Yeah. I don't know if there is any other country that does not have a divorce law. I'm always thinking, how long can we maintain this? Yes.
There's a recent study that I have read about. In America, there's this survey that's 75% of American Catholics would prefer a long-term cohabitation. But I think that's, in my own perspective, I think that happens because they have evolved their thinking that it's better to have a long-term relationship than in the long run get married and get divorced. I think that's what is happening today. And I think it's also happening here. That is why we don't have divorce. Because in my experience also in the parish, there are so many Catholics who practice long-term cohabitation.
Cohabit in the sense that they don't get married?
They don't get married.
They live together?
They live together. And I think that's also something like an influence to us from the Western side. And that, it's good to not decide muna to get married because, it's so hard to, if things could get in trouble with the relationship.
But what would be the position of the church regarding long-term cohabitation? That's what do you call that? Adultery?
Yeah, it is.
So it's like it's better to commit adultery than have a divorce.
I think that's one mentality.
But you're right. There are many couples now who really, parang it's more acceptable to live together, living in, than separate or have divorce. Maybe many Filipinos are still, most of us are still stuck on that, some kind of an ideal. I don't know what's with Filipinos, because they're so idealistic when it comes to family and marriage. They would rather suffer and persevere, than be, separated or get divorced or to separate from their spouse. Because for them, it's not just a failure of marriage, it's also a failure on their part. And they don't want to admit that they have failed. Not only in their marriage, but in themselves. So they would rather stay in the marriage, even if the marriage is not working anymore. But other people cannot do that. They can just probably say, I have failed, so I have to move on. Filipinos have a hard time accepting that they have failed, especially in terms of marriage. I don't know. But my question is always this: how long can the church, the Philippine church, hold its ground. No? Not to, well, hold its ground to oppose. Well, it will always oppose. But for how long the Filipino can hold its ground that no divorce in the Philippines? Especially with the kind of legislators that we have. Many of them have several wives. So it will favor them. Anyway, we are talking here of the idea. Okay, of the idea. And of course, it always, when I discuss these things, I always have to be kind of realistic, because I always think to myself, I'm teaching this course, I'm teaching about this, and then when I go out, people have different, they have different orientations. So my thinking is always, how do I answer them? How do you cannot answer them with Wojtyla. Okay? We go to say, sir, it's not you who suffers. Okay? It's not, you can't imagine the suffering. You can't imagine the kind of life I'm living. Or you cannot imagine my desire to start a new relationship, a new life, separated from my spouse, my husband or wife. Of course, there's always an answer to that, which is you can apply for annulment, but it's not easy to get an annulment. It's easy to get an annulment. Which is easier, to get annulment from the government or from the church? I don't know. Sir, saan ba mas experience, ano ba mas mabilis? Annulment, sa civil annulment or canonical annulment?
I think civil annulment is more
Strict?
it's
It's
more
easy.
faster, because even in our diocese, the cases stuck even from last year of cases of annulment.
No? That's right. And then we have more lawyers, civil lawyers, and very few canon lawyers. So who will handle the case of annulment? And we have very few canonical courts. How many priests and seminaries are studying canon law? No, seriously, ilan ang canon students na? It's good if one diocese will have one canon lawyer. But some of them will just have one canon lawyer, and that's it. And the canon lawyer is, as a lawyer, you have to continue to study. You have to update yourself. So, it's more complicated to get an annulment in the church rather, and it's aside from that, it's very expensive. Okay, it's very expensive to file annulment. Get annulment in the civil course. Acceptance fee how much? 100,000. Yeah. Because the lawyer has to build up your case. And you also have to talk to your spouse that you're going to file annulment. He has to agree. And sometimes the other party will also demand something. Okay, we'll agree to what you want. I'll give you annulment, but these are my conditions. Anyway, let's go back to the idea here. So, love and marriage. So, although Wojtyla's notion of love is applied to concrete persons, to all human relationships, one particular human relation that he applies his notion of love is the relationship between husband and wife in marriage. Okay? Which for him is a human relation where love is expressed genuinely between the couples. Right? So, marriage for Wojtyla is a genuine expression of love. Okay? Now, should we add there? Hopefully, it should be a genuine expression of love, because it's not always a guarantee that when people get married, that they genuinely love each other. No? Maybe they are just physically attracted to one another, no? But they are not really in love, no? Genuinely in love with one another. There is today an aggressive orientation to alter our understanding of marriage. Of course, marami tayong examples, no? They want to redefine marriage as the union between two individuals. But again, going back to the theology of the body of John Paul, he actually discussed the original unity of man and woman. So we always understand marriage as a union between man and woman, but some quarters are beginning to interpret it as the union between two individuals, which means that same-sex individuals can contract marriage as what is not being recognized as what is now, that's not now being recognized in other countries. So again, are we not way behind the other countries? The other countries have already legalized same-sex marriage, they have legalized divorce, they have legalized abortion. Pilipinas, wala pa, no? It's still illegal, no? Wala pa rin, ano yan. So, I think we are the last stand of the church. I mean, in terms of all these things. No? So, but such interpretation misses one point, one important element in marriage, according to Wojtyla, an element that has been present since the very beginning. That is, these individuals contracting marriage must be of opposite sex, meaning man and woman. Right? Incidentally, I have written an article and submitted this to the Filipiniana Sacra about marriage and the original unity of man and woman according to the theology of the body of John Paul II. And I discuss about the marriage, the sacrament of marriage, marriage in the Bible, marriage based on culture, and then marriage based on the church as a sacrament. Anyway, that's not our topic here. So love is put into practice in the relationship between man and woman in marriage, where two individual persons, a man and a woman, are united in such a way that they become one flesh, a common subject of sexual life. So he's talking about this in the love and responsibility, and then in the theology of the body, he is talking about the same thing. And it's not only in the theology of the body, even in the other writings of John Paul II, he's very consistent in this, no? Familiaris Consortio, what else? I mean, many other things, no? So, in marriage, the man and the woman share the same ends and subordinate themselves to these ends for the sake of their relationship and of each other. They share the same goal of continuously nurturing their relationship, oriented towards procreation and the raising of children and forming a family. So for Wojtyla, marriage is always oriented towards procreation and the formation of a family. This orientation of marriage towards procreation definitely can never be fulfilled in same-sex marriages. These objective purposes of marriage create, in principle, the possibility of love and exclude the possibility of treating a person as means to an end or as an object of use. Because if your orientation is to not just express your love, but to form a family, then what you're trying to form is a family, and your spouse is part of that family, and therefore it's a means of safeguarding the very dignity of your partner into not being treated as a means. Okay? So the mere consideration of the objective purposes of marriage does not guarantee that the danger of using a person as means will be avoided, because it seems that the sexual relationship in marriage presents more opportunities compared to other activities for treating the other as means or as an object of use. So Wojtyla recognizes that, yes, in marriage, the person can be safeguarded, but in marriage, it also presents more opportunities to abuse the spouse as compared to, for example, in a relationship that is outside the context of marriage. No? Because, for example, if you are only in that cohabitation relationship, they are not married. If the person realizes that he is just using me, or this person is not really for me, he's just abusing, then he can just leave, or she can just separate. But in the case of marriage, because they are married, there's no way he can just leave the house. So there are more opportunities to abuse the spouse than abuse your partner in a cohabitation arrangement. Sometimes one of the couple thinks that in marriage he or she owns his or her partner, and therefore he or she has all the right to use him or her for his or her gratification. So there are some people, majority males, of this orientation that he owns his wife like an object. No? So a person of the opposite sex cannot be treated only as means to an end or the object of person of another person, because the human being is a person. Enjoyment or pleasure must be subordinated to love. Okay? So for Wojtyla, it should be love, and in the context of that love, the context of marriage, then the pleasure, the enjoyment that both experience in that relationship becomes good. So for Wojtyla, enjoyment must be subordinated to love. So enjoyment should not take priority or precedence over love. Okay? You don't love because you want to attain pleasure. Okay? So, to use both in the first or objective meaning, that means to employ as means, and in the second or subjective meaning, to experience pleasure, can be raised to the level appropriate to an interpersonal relationship only by love. Only caring and loving can preclude using, both in its objective and subjective meaning. Right? So if you want to safeguard, the person in the relationship, the relationship should be based on love. Okay. All right. I will discuss this will be my last topic for the evening. Then I'll just discuss the other concepts. This is a very long, 17 out of 142. Okay. All right. So so he was very critical of this concept of using, because for Wojtyla, the opposite of loving is using. Okay. The opposite of love, of loving, of caring is to simply enjoy pleasure. So in the light of his discussion on love and using, Wojtyla extends his analysis to a critique of utilitarianism, a thought that considers the maximization of pleasure and the minimization of pain or discomfort as the standard of moral action. So we know, those of you who are familiar with the ethical theories, utilitarianism promotes pleasure. We have to attain as much pleasure as we can and avoid pain or discomfort. The useful for utilitarianism is whatever gives pleasure and minimizes pain or discomfort. Pleasure is the essential ingredient of human happiness. That's for utilitarianism. Okay? So they equate happiness with physical pleasure. It is experienced in different forms or degrees of intensity. So the utilitarian rule of maximizing pleasure and minimizing discomfort must be observed not only individually but also collectively by the society. Hence, utilitarianism asserts the maximization of pleasure for the greatest number of people. Of course, if we are familiar with the idea of utilitarianism, the main proponents of this are Jeremy Bentham and John Stuart Mill. Okay? The greatest happiness for the greatest number of people. Of course, there are also some positive points in utilitarianism, but he is critiquing utilitarianism in general. This seems to be right and attractive because it's normal to want to maximize one's pleasure and minimize one's pain. The real mistake, however, on the part of utilitarianism is to recognize pleasure in itself as a sole, or at any rate, the greatest good to which everything else in the activity of the individual or society should be subordinated. So we subordinate everything to pleasure. Okay. While pleasure is good, it is not the supreme or the highest good. So Wojtyla recognizes that pleasure is good, but it's not the highest good. Much less the only good. In the first place, pleasure is very transitory. May attain pleasure now, later on no more. Okay? And while pleasure is common to everyone, what would give pleasure is different from person to person. Okay? What would be pleasurable to me would not be pleasurable to other people. So pleasure is not the only factor affecting one's decision to act or not to act, much less the criterion by which one judges whether his action or that of another is good or bad. So the point of it is that we should not use pleasure as the sole criteria for saying whether something is good or bad, or for saying that we can attain happiness by simply attaining pleasure. So, in this sense, utilitarianism reduces the moral life to a simple calculation of advantages and disadvantages deriving from certain actions. The duty of wanting the good of the other, if I want the good of the other, depends on how the good will evoke a positive emotional reaction on the part of the subject. In other words, I will only decide what is good for you if it can also give me back the same or more amount of pleasure. Okay? To some extent, this idea of utilitarianism is very much close to hedonism. Okay? So here it misses the fact that man experiences a good which is not merely subjective but objective. And since such good is objective, it could be universal and could be joined together with other objective good of other human beings. So for Wojtyla, to accept then the utilitarian principle is to consider everyone as a possible means of obtaining maximum pleasure. So everyone becomes a means to attain my own pleasure, because the idea of utilitarianism is that I will only help you, I will only consider your good if that will also promote my own good, if that will give me pleasure. So, some people may say that is utilitarianism may be altruistic, but in the end, the ultimate measure is the amount of pleasure that I can generate from helping other people. So if the starting point is the utilitarian principle, it is difficult, in fact, impossible for the sexual relation of people of different sex to be raised to the plane of real love and be safeguarded from the danger of using a person in treating him as or her as a means to an end. Because my consideration will always be what will give me pleasure. Okay, so it promotes the attitude of manipulating or using other people. It may also be possible at one point one puts value not only in his or her own pleasure, but also in the pleasure of another person. But this will be so only insofar as the other's pleasure will also bring pleasure to the subject. So, in utilitarianism, a man may also consider giving pleasure to the other person, but only on the condition that by giving his pleasure, it will also generate as much or more pleasure for myself. So it becomes really a selfish attitude. So the moment one ceases to experience pleasure, or the other's pleasure does not coincide with her, the moment that the pleasure I generate from the other person stops, then I don't have any reason at all to be considerate for his own or her own good. Because my only consideration is my own pleasure. And since pleasure is temporary, momentary, it will stop. It will cease sooner or later. And when it ceases, then there's no reason for you, to be or to maintain the relationship. So in utilitarianism, the ultimate good would be the pleasure of each particular individual, so that in the final analysis, it becomes an egoism that is impossible to evolve into a genuine altruism. Because in utilitarianism, you will only have to consider the pleasure of each person. So, if I will stay in this relationship for as long as I experience pleasure, and the other person will also stay in a relationship for as long as he attains pleasure. I will give her pleasure or him pleasure for as long as I get my own. And she will also give me pleasure for as long as she can get her own. So it ends with two egoistic individuals. And it's impossible for that relationship to really evolve into a genuine altruism. Okay? And I think many of the relationships in contemporary, in our contemporary society, this is what is prevalent. Okay? This is what is prevalent. So the idea of sacrifice, the idea of self-giving is already gone. Or you may give yourself also to the other person, provided that he can give more to you. I get more than she or she can provide. So, theoretically, it may be possible to speculate about harmonization of egoism. Harmonization of egoism. What does it mean? The harmony of pleasure, according to the principle of greatest possible pleasure for each of two persons. Actually, when you consider the relationship, the marriage, for example, or the cohabitation of celebrities, you can see that the relationship is just based on this. As long as we are enjoying ourselves, that's fine. And the moment that they no longer enjoy themselves, what happens? After a very grand wedding, 5 years after, they separate. So, but in concrete reality, it is impossible to harmonize the egoism of the man and of the woman or their respective pleasures. This will work only for as long as their respective interests and pleasures are at the same level and they do not encounter anything unpleasant. Okay? And unpleasant is not just not pleasurable. Unpleasant could also be boring. So when the relationship is no longer exciting, it becomes boring, no fire anymore, they just go separate ways. What's the reason to stay in a relationship that eventually, will be boring? Very much similar to what Kierkegaard talks about the aesthete. The first level of life, first stage in Søren Kierkegaard existence, aesthetic. In aesthetic, right? So pleasure, okay, fine, so pleasure. Like Don Juan, Giovanni. Okay, and when the pleasure is gone, Don Juan transferred to another woman. Okay, so that's what happens. But since pleasure is subjective, once they experience discomfort or conflict in their mutual pleasure, nothing will be left of the harmony between them, and their relationship will eventually break apart. And maybe this will be the case, for example, of those people who have it, when they encounter rough times, okay, it's time to separate. So we don't have to divorce, we just have to separate. We didn't get married, we just experimented on our relationship. And unless they take their relationship on to the next level and get married. But getting married is always a risk. You always bet on your marriage, and you always have to work that your bet will work day in, day out. It's like betting that risky. It's a risk. Apparently, those people who would like to have long engagement, well, it's okay if they are long, it's engagement, but long cohabitation, maybe they wanted to be sure of themselves. If you always want to be sure of yourself, it's difficult to take risks. No? And it's not only true with marriage; it's also true with priestly vocation. When you decide to become a priest, you're also taking risks. Okay? How sure are you that you will not change? How sure are you that what you feel now will stay forever until you grow old, until you die? It reminds me of what Marcel was talking about hope. I can only hope. Okay? And what's the guarantee that your hope will come true? Hope. You have to be faithful, fidelity, constancy. And the only answer to that is to have faith. But faith is not a guarantee. This one is not also a guarantee. When you get the blessing of the priest, or in your case, when you get the blessing of your bishop, that's always a guarantee that you will stay in the priesthood. You have to work on it. Okay? So a relationship founded on pleasure may seem at the beginning quite a stable relationship. Actually, that's what actually starts the relationship. When you can get some pleasures with your partner. But if that is only based on pleasure, it will not last. But because we know from experience that pleasure does not last long. So, once the pleasure is gone, even in just one of the partners, that relationship will eventually collapse. So for Wojtyla, we cannot base love between man and woman on utilitarian principle. Alright, well, the personalistic norm here is simply that because the persons involved in love are persons, and therefore there is the personalistic norm in that relationship. So the norm is this: the one who loves is a person, the one who is being loved is a person, and therefore there should be a respect for the dignity, for the value person. That is the norm. That is the personalistic norm. We should never lose sight of the fact that the person who loves, or the subject who loves and is loved, they are persons. And therefore they should be respected as persons at all times. That's the only, for Wojtyla, that should be the ultimate basis of love between man and woman. Of course, he's talking here as a philosopher. Later on, when he talks about as the Pope, then he will include the idea of the blessing of the church, you know, God being at the center of the relationship between man and woman.